I wanted to say a few words about the name of the new book that we're starting to read this week. We finished the book of Bereshit, the first book of the 5 books of Moshe, of the Chumash, and this week we're starting the book of Shemot. It's a little bit shorter than the book of Bereshit, but it's also a very long book. The shortest book is Vayikra, the third book, that deals mostly with laws. And I wanted to mention a few interesting ideas. First of all, this name Shemot, or the way Ashkenazim pronounce it, Shemos, or some Sephardim pronounce it as Shemoth. You know that the consonant Tav in modern Hebrew and in some Sephardic pronunciations is always pronounced as T sound, like English T. Maybe it's slightly different. There are actually differences between Tet and Tav. There are some Sephardim who distinguish those two letters. They definitely used to be pronounced differently in the ancient Hebrew. But in today's modern Hebrew, Tet and Tav are pronounced the same way. And in English, there are no differences between different T sounds. So both Tav and Tet are pronounced as T. But the Tav without Dagesh, without the dot in the middle, is pronounced by Ashkenazim as S sound. But most Sephardim do not distinguish it from Tav without Dagesh, with Dagesh. In fact, most Sephardim don't distinguish Dalet with and without Dagesh, Gimel with and without Dagesh, and Tav with and without Dagesh. But there are some Sephardim that do distinguish all those letters, including the Yemenite Jews. So, according to the alternative pronunciation, which probably is the ancient pronunciation of our ancestors, Tav without Dagesh sounded like Th sound, TH in English. So, that's why you'll see the book of Shemot, sometimes pronounced as Shemos. And on the internet, when you do the search for this book, you'll find Shemos, Shemoth, and Shemot. But what this literally means is names. Did you ever hear the book of names? You always hear the book of Exodus, or literally the Hebrew word for it, Shemot. And the reason is, I think that it's common for us to not translate the names of books. We just say Dvarim, Vayikra, Bamidbar. Nobody really translates the books. If you'll see some reference, this is written in the book of, and he called. That's what literally Vayikra means. The third book of Torah, what the non-Jews generally call Leviticus, is called literally Vayikra, and he called. But nobody calls it that way. We either write the word Vayikra with English letters, if we want to write it in English, or maybe we will reference it by the same name as the non-Jews call it. And the reason is that the alternative names that the non-Jews use, and that is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, all those names come from Jewish sources. They're not invented by Christians. There was just 2 alternatives how to call every book. We could either call it by the plot, by summary of the plot somehow, or by one of the first words. Both were Jewish traditions. Our sages in the Talmud used both names for each book. In particular, the book of Vayikra, the alternative name is Torah Kohanim, the Torah of priests, which is basically what Leviticus is in Latin and in other languages. The 4th book was called the Pikude, meaning the census, which is what Numbers means. And the last book is called by our sages sometimes Mishnah Torah, the repetition of Torah, which is what Deuteronomy really means. So at least in the 3 of the 5 books of Moshe, we clearly see that Chazal used the same terms as was later used by Latin translation of Vulgata by Jerome, and then of course that's how it got into non-Jewish languages. So there's nothing wrong with calling a book the book of Leviticus. We find some Rishonim using somewhat similar term because our sages also called it Torah Kohanim. In case of Exodus, it's a little bit more complex. I don't think I ever saw in the words of the sages of the Talmud that they would use something equivalent to Exodus. But I do see that in the commentators, including Ramban, they call it the book of Geula, of saving, the redemption, the book of redemption, which is basically what Exodus is, coming out. There is also an old translation of the Torah into one of the versions of Aramaic language. I think it's called Middle Aramaic, the Syriac. Sursi, they called it in the Talmud, this language. So there's a translation called Pshita. And generally, it's the non-Jews who retain this translation. Certain Eastern churches retained it. But the translation of our Torah was definitely done by a Jew. It wasn't a Christian translation. It's just the Christians retained it. As opposed to Vulgata, for instance, a Latin translation done by a Christian, clearly nobody questions that translation was done by a Christian. The translation, for instance, into Greek, the Septuagint, was done by Jewish sages. It's just the Jews didn't preserve it and the non-Jews preserved it. But it was definitely done originally by Jews. I don't know to what extent it survived. Of course, there are different manuscripts and the Christian church edited it, but at least the original Septuagint was a Jewish translation. It just wasn't preserved by the Jewish people. We only preserved Aramaic translations generally. So Pshita, even though it's a type of Aramaic translation, it's not the regular Aramaic we usually use in Babylonian Talmud, but it's closer to the Talmud Yerushalmi, what's called the Talmud of the land of Israel. So that language was less preserved by the Jewish people, and the Pshita translation was lost throughout history, although there was some Jewish sages who quoted it sometimes. There was a certain sage recently, his name was Chaim Heller. He actually had a degree from Berlin University before World War II, I think. But anyway, his research was actually around Pshita. Interesting, right? A Jewish Orthodox sage who translated a lot of interesting things. He was very good, by the way, in ancient languages in general. He translated the original commentary of Rambam, Maimonides, to the Mishnah, which was written in Judeo-Arabic dialect. And there were already other translations, but not to the Mishnah, actually. It's called Mishnah Torah. It's called Sefer HaMitzvot, Sefer HaMitzvos. The commentary to the Mishnah was translated by other people, but the Sefer HaMitzvot, there were a few different translations, and one of them was by Rav Chaim Heller. So he was very good at all kinds of ancient languages, including the ancient Syriac. So my point is that the book of Exodus is called, in fact, in that translation, literally the book of Exodus, of coming out, literally. So it's exactly the same term used. And as I said, this was a Jewish translation. So it's definitely true that the other names, even though we don't find in Chazal, Genesis and Exodus being used, but something similar must have existed. Not everything is necessarily in the Talmud, not all the discussions the sages had. They just had no reason to mention this book by an alternative name. But if they did, probably they would be aware of a second type of name, similar to Exodus, or some kind of Sefer HaGeula, or Sefer of Coming Out, which is what Exodus means. And similarly Genesis, right, the book of Breshit. Breshit actually probably is the only one where there is a certain convergence. The first word of Breshit sort of sounds like Genesis anyway. So you don't even have to think of two different names. But in all the other cases, what we call the book, and we usually call it by one of the first words, as I said, usually does not really correspond to what the alternative naming is. For instance, Shemot means names, since the book starts with the words Ve'ele Shemot, and these are the names of the children of Israel who entered Egypt. So literally it's the book of names. But as I said, there was a second way to call this book, and that's similar to what the non-Jews do, and that is something like Exodus or delivery or salvation or something like that, the book of salvation. The same idea. So that's what I wanted just to say for today. So I don't think it's wrong for Orthodox Jews to quote the names that are generally accepted in the non-Jewish world, because as I said, those names were also popular among Jews as well, and in some cases we can prove it, and in some cases it seems logical. By the way, another good example might be the book of Eicha. It's the Lamentations in English. And in fact, the alternative name of the book of Eicha, of course, is the first word of that book. But the alternative name that Chazal quote is Kinot. Today we call Kinot the actual lamentations that we say on the 9th of Av, on our saddest day of the year. The various prayers we say, the various lamentations of what happened. But the original meaning of the word kinot in Chazal's, in the Talmudic sages' language, was actually this book. This book was called Kinot. So again, clearly, Kinot is lamentations, just that this is not as common today. Today we call it the book of Eicha, by the first word of this book. And if you like this video, please press like and please subscribe to our channel.